Welcome to our discussion on the evolution of presidential power. Although the constitutional powers of the presidency have changed a little over time, the power of the presidency has evolved a great deal. In part, this development stems from some presidents' skillful use of powers not granted by the Constitution, such as the powers to persuade and to assert more authority. But the political environment within which presidents have governed has also contributed to the evolution of presidential power. The history of the early republic saw an incremental expansion of the power of the presidency, whereas the Great Depression of the 1930s and the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1932 spawned an enormous growth of presidential authority. As successor presidents inherited the large bureaucracy that Roosevelt built, presidential powers have further expanded, gradually creating what historian Arthur Schlesinger has called the imperial presidency. Thomas Jefferson's election to the presidency in 1801 marked one of the earliest expansions of presidential power. Jefferson broadened the powers of the office despite his anti-federalist reluctance to delegate too much power to the national government. Jefferson increased presidential power in two significant ways. First, as we have seen, Jefferson established the principle of inherent powers of the presidency by undertaking the Louisiana Purchase. Second, Jefferson's tenure of office witnessed the first time that a president had to act as party leader. Jefferson had no choice but to assume this role. If he had not, he would not have been elected president given the dominance of the Federalist Party during this era. 25 years later, Andrew Jackson would also adopt the role of president as party leader, but he would add a new twist. Jackson's emphasis on populism, a political philosophy that emphasizes the needs of the common person, spawned a new source of presidential power, because Jackson was the first president to derive real and significant power from the people. Whereas earlier politics had mostly emphasized the needs of the elite, Jackson's populism mobilized the masses of common people who traditionally had not been civically engaged. This populism augmented the power of the presidency by increasing the popularity of the president and investing him with the power that came from the people's goodwill. In the 20th century, the nature and scope of presidential power changed as a consequence of the prevailing political environment. One of the most extraordinary shifts in the nature of the presidency occurred during FDR's administration, which lasted from 1932 until his death in 1945. Roosevelt was elected to an unprecedented 4 terms. The 22nd Amendment to the Constitution, which allows only 2 elected presidential terms, was ratified 6 years after his death. Having come to power during the Great Depression, Roosevelt engineered a significant change in the function of the federal government. He called for a New Deal for the American people, a series of social welfare programs that would provide employment for many of the nation's unemployed workers. Roosevelt's New Deal was based on the ideas of economist John Maynard Keynes, who argued for temporary deficit spending by the government, that is, going into debt, to spur the economy during economic downturns. Roosevelt's primary weapon in his New Deal arsenal was the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, a federal government program that employed 8.5 million people at a cost of more than $11 million between 1935 and 1943. The idea was that government-funded employment would create economic growth in the private sector because those employed by the government would have the money to buy goods and services, thus creating spiraling demand. The rising demand for goods and services would mean that the private sector could then employ more people, and the cycle of recovery and growth would continue. For example, if during the 1930s the government employed your great-grandfather to work on a road-building project in his town, he might have put his paycheck towards buying more bread and other baked goods than he previously could have afforded. If enough people in town could have similarly patronized the bakery, then the baker might have to add an assistant to keep up with demand, and consequently, the assistant would have money to spend on, say, new shoes for his children. In that way, the increased demands for products and services would continue, creating additional economic growth. Roosevelt's New Deal was important to the presidency for 2 reasons. First, it dramatically changed people's views of the role of the federal government. People now tend to think of the federal government as the provider of a safety net that protects the most vulnerable citizens, a safeguard that did not exist before the New Deal, when those needing assistance had to rely on the help of family, friends, churches, and private charities. Second, this popular perception and the program that emerged, the Works Progress Administration, Unemployment Insurance, and Social Security, meant that the federal government would have to grow larger in order to administer these programs. As a result, the president's role as chief executive would become much more important to modern presidents than it had been to those who served before Roosevelt. America's penchant for strong presidents modeled after Roosevelt diminished drastically in the 1970s. In 1971, an employee of the Department of Defense named Daniel Ellsberg leaked a classified, top-secret, 7,000-page history of the nation's involvement in and thinking on the Vietnam, dating from the Truman administration in 1945 to the Nixon administration then installed in the White House. Called the Pentagon Papers, the work first appeared as a series of articles in the New York Times. When the Nixon administration in 1971 successfully petitioned the Department of Justice to prevent the publication of the remainder of the articles, the Washington Post assumed publication of them. When the Department of Justice sued the Post, the Boston Globe resumed their publication. 2 weeks later, in an expedited appeals process, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in New York Times Company versus U.S. that the government carries a heavy burden of showing justification for the imposition of such a restraint, and that the government had failed to meet that burden, thus allowing the continued publication of the papers. The Pentagon Papers tainted the public's view of the presidency. The published work revealed miscalculations by policymakers in presidential administration from Truman's to Nixon's, as well as arrogance and deception on the part of policymakers, cabinet members, and presidents. Specifically, the Pentagon Papers revealed that the federal government had repeatedly lied about or misrepresented the fact of increasing U.S. military involvement in Southeast Asia. In particular, the analysis in the Pentagon Papers indicated not only that U.S. Marines had conducted offensive military maneuvers well before the public was informed, but also that the U.S. military had engaged in other actions, including airstrikes over Laos and military raids throughout the North Vietnamese coastal regions. The Nixon administration's legal wrangling to prevent release of the Pentagon Papers cast a dark cloud over the public's perception of the presidency. Cynicism about the presidency continued to grow in light of the Watergate scandal that took place a year later. In 1972, men affiliated with President Nixon's re-election campaign broke into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee, located in Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., to retrieve wiretaps that they had previously installed to monitor their opponents. Washington Post reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, in a groundbreaking series of stories, traced the burglaries and the subsequent cover-ups to high-level officials in the Nixon administration. This crime and the Nixon administration's attempts to cover up became known as the Watergate scandal. A Senate investigation revealed that President Nixon had secretly taped conversations in the Oval Office that would shed light on what the president knew about the break-in and when he knew it. Nixon claimed executive privilege and refused to turn the tapes over to a special prosecutor who had been appointed to investigate the scandal. When the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in U.S. v. Nixon that Nixon must provide the tapes to the special prosecutor, one key tape was found to have a gap of almost 20 minutes where someone, reportedly his secretary Rosemary Woods, had erased part of the recording. Meanwhile, all the Watergate burglars had pleaded guilty and been sentenced, and only one refused to name the superiors who had orchestrated the break-in. But the testimony of burglar James W. McCord, Jr. linked the crime to the Committee to Re-elect the President, or CREEP, Nixon's campaign organization, and to high-ranking Nixon White House officials. The disclosure prompted John Dean, Nixon's White House counsel, to remark, "We have a cancer within, close to the presidency, that is growing." With indictments handed down for many of Nixon's top aides, and with a Senate investigation and a special prosecutor's investigation in process, the House Judiciary Committee took up the matter of impeachment. The committee handed down 3 articles of impeachment against Nixon, one for obstruction of justice, a second for abuse of power, and a third for contempt of Congress. When a newly released tape documented that Nixon had planned to block the investigations by having the Federal Bureau of Investigations, or FBI, and the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, falsely claim that matters of national security were involved, the tape was referred to as a smoking gun. Nixon lost the support of his few loyalists in Congress, and on August 8, 1974, announced that he would resign from office the following day. Watergate might seem like a relatively insignificant event in the history of the American presidency, but the impact of the Watergate scandal on the presidency has been enormous. Watergate badly wounded the trust that many Americans held for their president and for their government. Combined with the unpopularity of the Vietnam War and the release of the Pentagon Papers, it created a deep cynicism that pervades many Americans' perception of their government even today, a pessimistic attitude that has passed from generation to generation. Watergate also dramatically demonstrated how enormously the presidency had changed. Modern presidents had supplanted Congress as the center of federal power, and in doing so had become too powerful. Historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and other presidential scholars have decreed the problem of the growth of the executive branch and, in particular, the imperial courts, the rising number of executive office of the president's staff members, many of whom are not subject to Senate confirmation and share a deep loyalty to the person who is president rather than to the institution of the presidency. In juxtaposition with an attitude like that expressed by Richard Nixon in his comment that, when the president does it, that means it is not illegal, the imperial presidency left much room for abuse. With the election of Jimmy Carter to the White House in 1976, many observers believed that the era of the imperial presidency had passed. Carter, the mild-mannered governor of Georgia and thus a Washington outsider, seemed to be the antidote the nation needed after the display of power run amok during Nixon's tenure. But given the significant challenges Carter faced during his term, many people believe that he did not exercise enough authority, that he acted weakly when faced with various crises. Ronald Reagan's election in 1980 in some ways represented a return to a more powerful imperial presidency. Reagan, a former actor, was Hollywood swagger personified, speaking tough talk that many Americans found appealing. His administration was not unlike an imperial court, featuring a group of advisors with deep loyalties to Reagan. Although the era of unchecked presidential power was gone for good, many would argue that the George W. Bush administration was best at recreating a form of an imperial presidency. Bush was able to exercise strong authority because of the fear created both among the citizenry and in Congress after the September 11, 2001 terror attacks. And given President Bush's activist foreign policy, he exercised great authority in that realm, with Congress having little ability to check him. Ironically, many critics of the Bush administration would assert that he was assisted in creating a modern imperial presidency by many of the same staff members who were part of the Nixon administration. But administrative supporters would note that a strong presidency was necessary at this critical juncture in the nation's history. Although presidential powers are flexible and can be shaped by the individuals holding the office, these powers do not go unchecked. One crucial check on presidential power is impeachment, the power of the House of Representatives to formally accuse the president and other high-ranking officials, including the vice president and federal judges, of crimes. The Constitution specifically refers to the charges of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. An appropriately vague description of the potential offenses a president could commit. An impeachment can be thought of as an indictment. If a majority of the members of the House of Representatives vote to impeach the president, they forward the charges against the president, called the Articles of Impeachment, to the Senate. The Senate then tries the president and, in the event of conviction for the offenses, determines the penalty. In convicting a president, the Senate has the authority to punish the president by removing him from office. Although the Senate can force a president to step down, it has never been done so in practice, and only 2 presidents have been impeached by the House of Representatives. The first was Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Abraham Lincoln as president in 1865 upon the latter's assassination. When he assumed the presidency, Johnson faced not only a divided nation, but also a government in turmoil. The 11 articles of impeachment against him had to do primarily with his removal of the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who was working with Johnson's congressional opponents to undermine Johnson's Reconstruction policies in the South. The so-called radical Republicans in the House believed that Johnson's policies were too moderate, and they sought to treat the Confederate States as conquered territories and to confiscate the land of slaveholders. Those same House members wanted to protect their ally Stanton and prevent him from being removed from office. The Senate ultimately recognized the political motivated nature of the articles of impeachment against Johnson and acquitted him on all counts. The most recent occurrence of the impeachment of a president was in 1998 when the House of Representatives approved 2 articles of impeachment against President Bill Clinton. On the basis of an investigation by a special prosecutor, the House impeached Clinton for lying to a grand jury about his relationship with White House intern Monica Lewinsky and for obstructing justice. The Senate acquitted Clinton on both counts. During the Watergate scandal that rocked Richard Nixon's presidency, the House Judiciary Committee approved articles of impeachment against the president and sent them to the full House for a vote. Republican members of Congress convinced Nixon that the House would vote to impeach him and that the Senate would convict him and remove him from office. Faced with the inevitable, Nixon became the first president to resign from office before the House could vote to impeach him.